The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Greenland and the Changing Arctic, Climate, Culture, and Self-Determination with Richard Caulfield. Caulfield is an author and the provost of the University of Alaska Southeast. His doctoral dissertation focused on aboriginal subsistence whaling in Greenland and cultural dynamics of natural resource use in the Arctic.
Well, good evening and welcome, or perhaps I should say Tikitluaritsi Tamasi in the Greenlandic Inuit language, Kalaallit. It's a real privilege for me to be here tonight with all of you and with some great friends and to present a talk about Greenland and the changing Arctic, climate, culture, and self-determination. I've been a student of Greenland for the past 25 years. It commenced when I was a doctoral student at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, and at that point in time I was given an opportunity to do work on aboriginal subsistence whaling in Greenland. And I had just spent time working here in Alaska for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and spent time in many rural and remote communities across the state. And I was looking for an opportunity to do a comparative study of rapid social and cultural and economic change in the Arctic, and the opportunity to go to Greenland was just too good to pass up. A distinguished Greenlandic politician by the name of Finn Lunge talked to me at a conference and understood that I was interested in the possibility of doing this type of research, and he said, well, if you're interested, we would love to have you come and do a research project on aboriginal subsistence whaling in Greenland. So that led to my wife and I and our children moving to Qaqatassuaq in West Greenland, and then later on I spent time as a visiting scholar at the University of Greenland, Ilisimartusarfik in Nuuk, the capital city. So my research focused, and the talk tonight will be on the indigenous peoples of Greenland and their responses to a rapidly changing world. Just a quick overview of the talk. I am going to talk briefly about the changing Arctic and very dynamic ecological factors that influence and have influenced life in Greenland over the last 10,000 years. I'll talk briefly about some of the history of Greenland, and especially focusing on the 20th century, a path from colonization. Greenland is a part of the Danish realm, into home rule in 1979, and then more recently a path towards indigenous self-rule and perhaps even independence. And then I'll offer some observations about climate change, culture, and self-determination. I do want to say that even though I'm going to talk about ecological dynamics here, I'm not a climate scientist, and I'm going to stay away from offering projections about climate change, but nevertheless I want to point to the importance of those forces in Greenlandic life for the last 1,000 years or more. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about perceptions of Greenland. I was interviewed on K2 earlier this afternoon, and the question is, Greenland, you know, we have so many ideas of what Greenland is all about. And for many people, this is what they know of Greenland. If they're lucky enough to fly between Anchorage and Europe, somewhere between the third and the fourth in-flight movie, if they open their window, this is what they'll see. And depending on the weather, it can be a vast, foreboding, extremely cold environment, seemingly uninhabited by people. If you look at a Mercator projection, you'll have this image of Greenland, which is this vast white landscape on the horizon that seems to rival Africa in size. And for others, this is increasingly an impression that people have about Greenland. If you read the newspapers or listen to news broadcasts, the concern about climate change in Greenland, and this is an image on the left of what Greenland might look like without an ice cap. But what I want to do is put a human face on Greenland. My background is as an anthropologist, and my interest has always been the interface between human societies and the natural environment. In fact, that's what brought me to Alaska now 40 years ago. What better place than Alaska to look at issues of rapid social, economic, and cultural change? And Greenland presented yet another opportunity to really explore some of these themes. So I included here a few photographs to give you a visual image of what Greenland looks like from a human perspective. You see a family on the left in their what's called Kalaallit, which is the traditional Greenlandic costume, the regalia of the Greenlandic people. You see hunters on the right wearing polar bear pants out on the sea ice. This is the coastline in West Greenland, and there's a ferry system that travels up through these coastal communities, just like we have here in Alaska. And this is the town of Qaqatassuaq. Qaqatok is island, and Suwak is big, so Qaqatassuaq literally is big island. The town of Qaqatassuaq has about 1,200 people, and there's a nearby community, Kangerluk, which has a population of about 70 people. This is where my family and I lived for a good part of a year and a half back in the early 1990s. Qaqatassuaq's history goes back at least 1,000 years, but in more recent colonial times, it was an important whaling station and trading station. It's got a terrific harbor. So the Basque, the Dutch, the English all came to Qaqatassuaq over the years to trade and to catch whales in nearby Disco Bay. You can see the jawbone of a bowhead whale at the entrance to the harbor in Qaqatassuaq, and you see a photograph there of fin whales in the area right close to Qaqatassuaq, and then also seal meat drying on racks. So hunting and fishing in a traditional Inuit style continues to be very important to the identity of Greenlandic Inuit people. Here's an image of a home, and you see a boat nearby. People like to get out on the water. In the summertime, you see the Greenlandic flag flying. We'll talk more about Greenland's relationship with Denmark and the Danish realm in a moment. Seal hunting continues to be very important in people's lives, both for food, to be able to sell seal pelts, hooded seal skin on the right-hand side. My mentor, Lars Peli Bertelsen, and his son Stevie on the left-hand side, hunting a seal out of a seal hole, or an aslu. Sealing has also been very contentious between Greenlanders and residents of the European Union and animal rights organizations. So that's been a force that has caused Greenlanders to really challenge and look for avenues for self-determination because of the resistance they've seen to being able to take marine mammals on a sustainable basis. This is fishing for Greenlandic halibut or turbot out on the sea ice. And one of the big concerns about climate change in Greenland is the sea ice is an immensely important platform for hunting and fishing, as you can see here. So this is a gentleman who's out there with a hole in the ice and a long line on the bottom pulling up Greenlandic halibut. In Qaqatassuaq, there were more dogs than people. So dog teams continue to be very important in Greenland. Interestingly enough, when we were living there in the early 1990s, hunters absolutely resisted using snow machines. They did not embrace them initially, although that's changing over time. But there was such a strong attachment to the use of dog teams with a fan hitch, as you see here, that the Greenland hunters generally were very resistant to the notion of snow machines coming onto the landscape, and especially going out onto the sea ice because of the concern about pollution and the smell of fuel on the ice and what that might do to their success in catching seals. And this is the type of iceberg that you'll see in Disco Bay, the waters just off of Qaqatassuaq. Many of you have heard about Sermersooq, or the very large glacier that seems to be putting off a huge amount of ice near the town of Ilulissat, which is nearby, and it's these types of huge, huge icebergs that appear on the horizon. So let me turn just very briefly to Greenland in brief, a few quick facts. Greenland, in fact, is Kalaallit Nunaat. That's the Greenlandic way of saying it's Greenlanders' land, literally. It's the world's largest island. It's part of the North American continent, 85% covered by ice. Highest elevation is about 12,000 feet, and it's 1,600 miles from north to south. Alaska, I think, is about 1,300 miles from north to south. And the climate is it's cold, but relatively mild in the wintertime, and definitely also mild in the summertime, something much like a Juneau summer. Its population, about 57,000 people, so just slightly larger than Juneau when you think about it, or about twice the size of Juneau. And the official language is Kalaallit. There are various dialects, 3 different dialects spoken in Greenland, but all of these are connected to the Inuit and Yupik language family. The capital city is Nuuk, has a population of about 15,000 people. And as I said earlier, its political status today is referred to as self-rule within the Danish realm. So it's a part of Denmark. Its economy is highly dependent, as you'll see in a moment, on fish and shrimp. In fact, Greenland is the largest exporter of cold water shrimp in the world. Most of the markets are in Europe, a little bit to the United States. Greenlandic halibut is another important product, cod, and to a smaller extent, minerals, but we'll talk more about minerals in a moment. And Danish subsidies. Denmark subsidizes Greenland, the 57,000 people, to the tune of $670 million a year. So it's a tremendous subsidy from Denmark. I mentioned Greenland's Inuit identity, and you can see in blue here where that Inuit and Yupik language family is found. And so in West Greenland, if you talk about a tutu is caribou, and that's exactly the word that was used when I was in Bethel last week talking about caribou, tutu. Umimmak, muskox, it's exactly the same. So I happened to be in Greenland one time when we were getting a direct feed from Canada of the Arctic Winter Games. CBC North was presenting the Winter Games, and so they were using the Inuktitut dialect of northern Canada, Nunavut, and Greenlanders could understand probably 70 to 80% of the language. So it's part of the same language family, but the loan words on the rest of the North American continent are generally English, whereas the loan words in Danish, like when you count beyond 11, are Danish words. So I want to switch to ecological forces that have really had an impact on Greenland over the last 1,000 years and really 100,000 years. Climate, temperature, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and sea ice changes. If you look at Greenland's temperature changes, and this is from ice core data taken from cores that have been drilled all the way down to the bottom of the Greenland ice sheet, you can see the dramatic changes that have taken place in temperature in Greenland over time. Up until the Younger Dryas era, about 12,000 years ago, you can see a dramatic rise in that temperature. And what's striking about this is the last 10,000 years or so, on the right-hand side of that, is how relatively stable our climate environment has been. Another driver is the North Atlantic Oscillation system of high pressure and low pressure in the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and then down by the Azores in the mid-Atlantic, and the positive and negative influence that has on temperatures and on sea ice in the North Atlantic. A third factor is the North Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and here you can see temperature changes from 1850 up to about 2010, and again you can see significant shifts over time, and Greenlanders have had to adjust to these types of changes, often in periods of about 60 or 70 years where there's a dramatic change in sea temperature that causes a change in the resources that are available to them. And then changing sea ice. I talked a moment ago about the importance of sea ice for hunting as a hunting platform, and here you can see more recent data about changes between 1980 and 2010 in the sea ice in the Arctic, and this pattern is expected to continue into the future. Turning to early human settlements, humans have inhabited Greenland for over 4,000 years, and so it goes all the way back to Paleo-Eskimo peoples, independence culture, Sakak people, and more recently, the late Dorset culture, which ended up extending into about 1300 AD. And then more recently, the Thule Inuit people, who were a wave of Inuit people who came across from northern Canada into Greenland and, in fact, interacted with the Norse settlements. The Norse came to Greenland in about 986, and their settlements, the East Settlement and the West Settlement, extended at least as far as 1409. The last communication between the East Settlement of the Norse in Greenland was 1409, but it's expected they went on a bit longer, but that's the last communication they actually had with people in Iceland. And you get an idea of the impact of changing temperatures on human settlements. You can see here 2 millennia of Arctic temperatures, and the time about just before at 986 AD when the Viking settlements were established, and you can see that they were at a high point of temperature, and then the temperature overall declined following that period of time. And one of the big challenges that we'll talk about in a moment is shipping and the impact of sea ice on providing goods and services from Iceland to Greenland. Thinking about the colonial settlement of Greenland, between the time when the Norse disappeared, and of course the Norse traveled widely throughout the North Atlantic. They traveled to Newfoundland. There's a site in Newfoundland where the Norse had a trading station, a way station. The Icelandic sagas talk about a young man named Snorri who was born in Newfoundland. His mother and his father, who was a chieftain, took tribute from Iceland and Greenland, including narwhal tusks and ivory, back to Rome as a tithe to the Pope. So the Vikings were traveling all over the North Atlantic at this period of time. But after the demise of the Norse settlements, the Inuit were really on their own, the Thule Inuit, for several hundred years. But then Basque whalers started showing up. The Basque had been catching whales in the Bay of Biscay and then moved continually north. Not much is known about that, but the Dutch came later, the English came, and so Greenlanders began to have opportunities to trade with Europeans. And there were a lot of problems associated with that trade, but it provided goods and, to the Inuit and products that the Europeans were anxious to have. In 1721, a Danish-Norwegian missionary, Hans Ede, arrived from Norway, and his intent was to reconnect with the Norse settlements and bring Christianity to the Norse. But when he got there, he realized that they were not present, and so he turned his efforts towards missionizing the Inuit people there. That brought a huge amount of social disruption. In the 1730s, there was a tremendous smallpox epidemic. Large numbers of Greenlanders died. They had no way to resist European diseases, and orphanages were set up. It's a theme that we know here in Alaska as well. So a great amount of social disruption. In 1775, the Danes decided to close Greenland entirely, and actually Greenland remained closed to the outside world until World War II. They created a closed trading monopoly, and they were looking to benefit from seal skins and whale blubber and things of that nature. So that lasted up until World War II. In the 1800s, there was a growing colonial presence in Greenland that had positive and negative effects, but a couple of things that happened during that period of time was the Greenlandic Inuit language was written down for the first time. A newspaper was established, Atuagatluttit, so you can actually go back today to a newspaper in Greenland written in 1861, written by Greenlanders in their own language. And so it's a fascinating resource for learning about the perceptions of hunters and so forth. Another interesting thing during this period of time is, again, very few Danes learned to speak the Greenlandic language. And so children, young people of mixed Danish Greenlandic heritage who grew up learning both Danish and Greenlandic in their homes, people like Knut Rasmussen, for example, became part of an emerging Greenlandic elite. And that emerging Greenlandic elite knew how to navigate between traditional Greenlandic society and Danish society. And they became the forebears of important Greenlandic families, political families that are prominent in Greenland even to this day. They also started a teachers' college, and so early on, Greenlanders wanted to have schooling in their own language, and so that dates back to about 1860 as well. Shifting into the 20th century, a shift from a colonial history into more modern times. In the early 19-teens, about 1916 or so, sea temperatures changed quite dramatically. And that brought in an influx of Atlantic cod and shrimp into Greenland waters that wasn't present before. It made it more difficult to catch seals and rely on hunting of marine mammals. And so you began to see the emergence of an economy in Greenland based on cod fishing and on shrimp. I mentioned World War II a moment ago. Denmark was invaded by the Germans and was cut off. So the Danish ambassador in Washington, D.C. cut a deal with the United States government and with the Canadians to occupy Greenland. And Greenland became important for strategic purposes, for weather stations, for landing fields, and of course the transition of planes across the North Atlantic. So there were airfields that were built along the way. After the Second World War, Greenland opened up. No longer did you have to have permission from the Royal Greenland Trade to travel to Greenland or do work there. And so Greenland formally became a part of the Danish realm in 1953. It was no longer officially a colony. But in the 1950s and 60s, there was a tremendous expansion of Danish colonial power in Greenland. That included large importation of Danish workers who came to build new facilities, new infrastructure. The Danish government, like many Scandinavian governments, likes to do centralized planning. And for Greenland, that meant largely shutting down a large number of small villages. So the Greenland government, controlled by the Danes, more or less said, we're going to shut down your small villages. People are allowed to stay, but the post office went away, the school went away, the store went away. There was no infrastructure support. And the goal was to bring people into regional hubs and work as factory workers in fish processing plants. So this generated a lot of disruption, brought in a lot of Danish workers to build new apartment complexes in places like Nuuk. You can go to the capital city today and you see these very large apartment blocks, and that was to bring people from very small rural communities into the larger cities to become workers in various capacities. But unsurprisingly, that caused quite a pushback or resistance from many Greenlanders who felt that they were losing control over their own lives, their own land. There were also conflicts over Aboriginal whaling and sealing, as I mentioned before. Animal rights movements started up and people were being told that taking seals, taking whales, even on a sustainable basis, was anathema to Europeans, and so that caused a lot of consternation as well. That resistance led to a path towards self-rule, and it really came to a head in about 1973. Denmark joined the European Economic Community, the EEC, the forerunner to the EU, and with that, Greenland, of course, being part of the Danish realm, was obliged to open up their fisheries to the Portuguese and a number of others, the Spaniards and so forth. There was a huge resistance in Greenland to that. And that led to an effort that culminated in 1985 where Greenland actually left the EEC. Denmark remained a part of it, Greenland left. It was the first time any territory had left the EEC, so it was quite a major step. But importantly, Greenland retained access to European markets. So it's a very shrewd move on their part. They didn't have to share their fisheries with the Spaniards and the Portuguese, but they still got to sell their fish to European markets. And at the same time, some of you will remember in the 1970s, there was an emergence of aboriginal identity or indigenous identity across the circumpolar north. And that included the creation of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference in 1977. So Greenlanders took renewed pride in being Greenlandic, their language, their way of life. So the language itself, Kalaallit, grew as a marker of indigenous identity and as a form of resistance against Danish colonial power. And to this day, the language continues to be a very, very important marker of Greenlandic identity. In 1979, Greenlanders, because of all these changes, achieved what is called home rule within the Danish realm. Home rule means basically the Greenlanders control domestic affairs and they rely on Denmark for foreign policy, for monetary policy and things of that nature. They have now their own parliament and they have their own premier, but they remain part of the Danish realm. 20 years later, in 2009, Greenlanders took this to a next step. They created the Greenland Self-Government Act, which took Greenland even closer to a path towards independence. 75% of Greenlandic voters voted for independence from Denmark. Now that hasn't happened, but it was a sentiment, it was an indication of the sentiment that people had about wanting to move beyond the colonial relationship with Denmark. But under the Greenland Self-Government Act, Denmark continues to retain control over foreign affairs, defense, and monetary policy. Denmark continues to provide substantial subsidies, as I said, about $670 million to 60,000 people living in Greenland. So it's a dramatic, very substantial subsidy. But increasingly today, and this is something that's very interesting for me to observe after spending about 30 years now, 25, 30 years in Greenland, is to see how the views of Greenlanders have changed towards industrial development from, say, 25 and 30 years ago, because they view it as an avenue towards independence. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment here. Greenland today remains highly vulnerable to just a very few resources, and if that sounds familiar with Alaska, it is. Shrimp and cod and other fish equal 90% of their exports. And Greenlanders know how fickle these resources are. As I mentioned back in 1916, a change in sea temperatures brought an influx of cod and shrimp. So just as quickly as those resources showed up along Greenlandic shores, Greenlanders know those could go away, and markets could go away, and the price could drop. And so those are all things that we're familiar with here in Alaska. So you can see how vulnerable they are based upon the very few exports that they currently have. The export market is, the products are produced through a company called Royal Greenland and one other called Polar Seafoods, and they use very large seagoing trawlers to trawl for cold water shrimp off of Greenland's shores. I mentioned the Danish subsidy, $650 million annually, 56% of government spending. So you can see here how the Danish block grant, which is now capped through this self-rule arrangement, but continues to be a very significant part of their income, is very important to their future. I mentioned that Greenlanders are increasingly looking to oil and gas and to minerals. And this is not something they've come to easily. In fact, I would have said when I first went to Greenland back in 1990, the hunters, the fishers would have said, oil and gas is off the table. We have no interest in seeing oil and gas development take place in Greenlandic waters. Our fisheries are too important to us. But over recent decades, you can see the change in the views of government officials and changes in the views of the population with the goal of with self-rule and perhaps independence in mind. So what you've seen in recent years is drilling 15 different wells, for the most part in West Greenland, for the most part unsuccessful, by ExxonMobil, Statoil, BP, and other companies. So Greenlanders have made their laws and their regulations much more friendly towards industrial development, and we're beginning to see some of the impact of those changes. East Greenland, that you can see here, the U.S. Geological Survey has identified 3 prospective basins, and there's a reasonable prospect of finding oil and gas in these areas, but I think anyone who knows this area or looked out that jet airplane window as they crossed this realized how really difficult this is to operate in as an oil company. So where this unfolds, how it unfolds over time remains to be seen. And mineral resources. Again, Greenland's government today has said they're looking to create 3 to 5 major mines by the year 2018. I think most people believe that's probably not realistic, but it gives you a sense of the importance of oil and gas and mineral development to Greenland's independence down the line. But there's some interesting issues here. The primary resources that are under exploration are iron ore, uranium, rubies to some extent. There was discussion with Alcoa about building a smelter in West Greenland because of the abundance of hydroelectric power that's there. None of these have really taken off as yet, but one of the big concerns has been the influx of, or the possible influx of foreign capital into Greenland, particularly from China. And there was a proposal focused on the development of this smelter, as I mentioned, in West Greenland, on bringing in large numbers of foreign workers paid a low wage into Greenland. And because Greenland remains a part of the Danish realm, and Denmark is a very social democratic country, labor unions are very prominent, there's been a huge resistance to the notion of bringing cheap labor into Greenland to build some of the infrastructure that would be required for any of this development, and a concern that, like in the 1950s and 1960s, Greenlanders would be overwhelmed by the kinds of changes that they're not sure they're very happy about. So those are some of the issues that they're dealing with. Another is mining uranium. Interestingly enough, Greenland, for many years, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was a leading advocate for a nuclear-free Arctic. And again, seeing the change that have taken place in people's attitudes towards this, today there's significant interest in mining uranium. In fact, there's just been a change in government in Nuuk, in part because of the debates about whether this is an appropriate thing to do. Many people continue to resist the notion of mining uranium, but the current government is saying they're willing to go there with proper environmental controls. Interestingly, Danish public opinion is resistant to mining uranium for the reasons I mentioned before. So there's a bit of a standoff between Greenland and Denmark and the rest of the European Union today over whether it's appropriate for mining companies to mine uranium in Greenland. So shifting gears to climate change. The climate models, and there are more recent data as well, but the most current that I had readily available point to the fact that average temperatures will rise by more than 3 degrees Celsius in this century. And that's from the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. Greenland's ice shows pronounced thinning over the past 20 years, and this has only continued. I just looked up some recent data, and that thinning continues at a very rapid rate. The Greenland ice sheet continues to melt, and it contains enough water to raise global sea levels by 7 meters. So it's no wonder that the world community is concerned about the melting of Greenland's ice cap. For Greenlanders themselves, the impact of climate change are clear. They're already seeing this, deteriorating sea ice that I mentioned. The photograph I had of my colleague Lars Pili Bertelsen and his son Stevie standing out on the ice in Disco Bay, they could not do that today because that ice is no longer there in the wintertime the way it once was. So elders who understood how to hunt out on the ice and what was safe, what was not, what storms would be coming through, all of that is very uncertain today. So Greenlanders are already seeing the impacts of melting sea ice, the loss of a hunting platform. Changes in migration patterns and timing of resource availability. Again, Greenlanders have long relied on marine mammals, but if the hunting platform that's important for your success in that endeavor is gone, it requires dramatic changes in your way of life. And they know about the economic vulnerability. So these are the kinds of concerns that Greenlanders have about what they see going on around them. But what's interesting is this sense of Greenlandic pragmatism. As Melina Abelson, the Greenland Minister of Social Affairs, says, in Greenland we refuse to be mere victims of climate change. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when you think about Greenland and its population, Greenlanders have lived with climate change over many, many years. They're aware of the impact it can have on their way of life. But they are being proactive about it to the extent that they can, and self-determination, self-rule government is a step in that direction. Inuit Olsen, Greenland's representative to Washington, D.C., said, people in Greenland are very practical in nature. They look at things from the perspective of their daily lives. For us, climate change has both negative and positive consequences. We can only adapt to the changes we experience and use the positive effects, but also deal with the negative effects, which is much more difficult. And here he's referring to opportunities to develop hydropower, the fact that the Greenland ice sheet is retreating and exposing more mineral deposits or areas for exploration. And so there's great interest in the possibility of exporting electricity down the line. Interestingly, Inuit Holm Olsen was a student of mine at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Back in the 1980s, there were 13 Greenlandic students who came and earned their degrees at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Inuit earned his in political science. He went on to earn his master's degree at George Washington University and became Greenland's representative to the European Union in Brussels, and now is the Greenlandic representative in the Danish embassy in Washington, D.C. So it's great to see those who've studied here in Alaska become so successful. So just some concluding observations and then a chance for questions and discussion. Just to reiterate, Greenland's history is one of changing climate. You can see this going back 1,000 years, you can see it go back 10,000 years. But in the lives, the stories, the memories of Greenlanders today, they know how rapidly climate can change. So it's nothing new to them, it's how you respond to it that really is key. Survival requires anticipation and adaptation. And one of the interesting stories is the comparison between the Tula Inuit and the Norse who settled in Greenland, in southern Greenland. Of course, the Norse were there for almost 500 years. They were very successful by every account for a period of time, but then they disappeared. And a lot of questions about exactly why that happened. Climate change was certainly a part of it. There's discussion about the Norse having very much an agricultural society based on the way of life they knew in Iceland and in Norway. Suggestions that they were more rigid and stratified society, not able to take on new technologies or take advantage of resources when they became available. Concern about, or observations about growing amount of sea ice that would have made ship travel between Iceland and Greenland more difficult, greater loss of ships and so forth, loss of lives. So the Norse disappeared, but the Greenlandic Inuit people survived and thrived at the very same time. So the Inuit people knew how to use a toggle harpoon, they knew how to use the sea ice as a hunting platform, and in fact they survived and thrived when the Norse disappeared. So some interesting comparisons there in terms of how different societies respond to the changes that they confront. And then finally, the melting ice creates economic opportunities that may well support Greenlandic independence. That Greenlandic pragmatism that I spoke about, I think we see this here in Alaska as well, a very pragmatic approach to development, looking to hold on to things that are important and dear, and yet at the same time, in the interest of moving forward and creating better livelihoods, looking at things that would have been unthinkable even 20, 30, or 50 years ago. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you, or Kwayanak, and I want to express my appreciation to the Juneau World Affairs Council, to the Greenland Home Rule Government, which originally supported my work in Greenland, Qaqatassuaq Kunmunia, which is the municipality in which my family and I were able to live, and to Lars Pili and Magdalene Bertelsen, who are our mentors and friends and are to this day. He was the mayor of Qaqatassuaq and the priest in the community, and the work that I did in Greenland could not have been done without the support of Lars Pili, Magdalene, and their family. So with that, I will stop and be happy to entertain any questions. We have a microphone here, and I think they'd like anyone who has a question to go ahead and use the mic. Thank you.
Hi, I had a question. You mentioned Iceland a couple times, and it sort of connected the two. I've always seen them as connected. What is the relationship between Iceland and Greenland?
Well,
historically
of course,
and now?
In terms of going way back, early human settlements, as I said, Greenland is the farthest extent that Inuit people reached to the east. And so there's no connection culturally in the early settlements between Greenland and Iceland, except the interface between the Norse settlements in southern Greenland and the Inuit people there. Iceland, of course, was settled by the Norse, and Icelandic, the language that's spoken today, is Old Norse, spoken by about 350,000 people. So, but to answer your question about today, Greenlanders and the government of Greenland and the government of Iceland share much in common. There's a lot of collaboration between the two. Both are heavily reliant on fisheries economy. Both rely on marine mammals for part of their livelihoods. Because of the Danish connection for Greenlanders, there's a strong connection to the Nordic countries, Scandinavia and the Nordic countries, including Finland. So there's a lot of political cooperation between those in Iceland and Greenland today.
Dr. Caulfield, you mentioned that your research was on whaling. Greenland. Could you talk a little bit about Greenlandic whaling and then the subsistence uses and how they differ around here?
Yeah. So again, going back to the Greenlandic Inuit tradition, Greenlanders have caught whales, as we do here in Alaska, probably for at least 1,000 years. They're frames of old umiaks, or skin boats that are dated back to that period of time. And so Greenlanders, for the most part, took bowhead whales, the right whales, because of the richness of their oil and the muktuk, the blubber and so forth, just like here in Alaska. But with the arrival of European whalers, the Dutch, the Basque, the English, and later the Americans, the number of bowhead whales in that discrete population in Davis Strait and Baffin Bay was diminished far below, I believe, what was the case here in Alaska, even though there was certainly controversy about population numbers here in Alaska as well. And so back in about the early teens, 1910, 1915, Denmark agreed that Greenlanders would no longer take bowhead whales. And by and large, that held. By and large, Greenlanders switched to other species. So they switched to fin whales, they switched to minke whales, to some extent to humpback whales, along with beluga and narwhal. And so that led up to the time when the International Whaling Commission was formed in 1946, and Denmark joined the International Whaling Commission, and Greenland fell under the aboriginal subsistence whaling provisions of the International Convention on Whaling, just as we see here in Alaska and the United States. So in more recent decades, Greenland has had a quota under this aboriginal subsistence whaling provision for aboriginal subsistence take of fin whales and minke whales, along with beluga and narwhal, which actually are not covered by the IWC directly. It's been a source of huge controversy because there are, of course, nations that believe that no whaling should take place. There are nations that are willing to accept aboriginal subsistence whaling as a practice, but insist that it be done in the most humane way possible. And interestingly, the most humane way possible usually involves the greatest amount of technology, and we see that here in Alaska as well, where the so-called traditional way of taking bowheads, for example, on the North Slope involved 19th century Yankee whaling technology. And today, that's changed to the point where aboriginal subsistence whalers here in Alaska and also in Greenland are using relatively high-tech concussion grenades to kill a whale right away, very, very quickly, as opposed to what you might have seen in years past. So you have this interesting contradiction of aboriginal subsistence whaling, which remains very important to the way of life of people here in Alaska and to people in Greenland, and yet under the IWC rules, they're obliged to use the most sophisticated technologies, very expensive technologies that require a large amount of training for hunters and so forth. So it's an interesting contradiction, and a lot of the work that I did was looking at that particular development over time. The other thing that's interesting about whaling in Greenland is that Greenlanders relish the opportunity to use the local resources for their way of life, which means that they like to hunt seals, they like to hunt whales. It's local, it's sustainable, it's healthy. It's not importing sausages from Denmark. And so for them, it's taking local products like that in a sustainable fashion is just absolutely what should be. But they have received a lot of criticism for the whaling that they've done. They have a mechanism where you will find whale meat, for example, in the shops in Nuuk, the capital city, and people have been critical of that. But Greenlanders say the distinction, a sharp line between subsistence hunting and commercial hunting doesn't make sense in the Greenlandic context. So some of my research was trying to understand how Greenlanders are seeking to use locally available, healthy, nutritious foods when other people in other countries are opposed to that. And so there's been a lot of conflict over just that set of issues. But Greenlanders insist that they want to be able to continue taking marine mammals and caribou and muskox and so forth that are local, that are sustainable, and that are healthy.
I just saw a Canadian movie about Canadian Inupiats and climate change. And the elders who were interviewed basically said their cultural lifeways are over because of climate change, that their subsistence lifestyle is so devastated by climate change that it was almost a hopeless movie. Now, my question is, in Greenland, is there an indigenous movement, not just to gain something out of climate change or adapt, but rather to work internationally and nationally to limit carbon emissions?
There are non-governmental organizations with a lot of support in Greenland and certainly in Denmark for just the kind of thing that you're talking about. But I think, going back to your point about the elders that you witnessed in the film, and I think that the thing that's really striking to me is how Greenlanders are not sitting back and feeling like they are in fact victims of this, but they're trying to be proactive. So I think you will find individuals and you'll find organizations that are trying to put a spotlight on issues of climate change. But I think from my perspective, what's really interesting is how Greenlanders are trying to anticipate and adapt to the changes that they see in their daily lives.
Dr. Caulfield, you said that when you were going to initiate research in Greenland, you had some ideas of doing a comparison with things in Alaska. And so I thought maybe you could give us a couple of your ideas on that.
Sure. Well, I think certainly, you know, they're common histories, including a colonial history. If you look at some of the dramatic changes that have impacted Greenland, I mentioned in the 1950s and 1960s, a dramatic influx of workers from outside, a sense in local indigenous communities that they're sort of being overwhelmed and don't have a lot of control over their way of life. That was the case in Greenland, and it's still a concern today, as I mentioned, with regard to, say, large-scale mining projects or what have you. So in Greenland, there's been this concerted effort towards self-determination and even independence, and it's a reflection of that approach. And I think here in Alaska, I would say you see the same phenomena going on in a lot of rural and remote communities where people are trying to hold on to what's dear to them about hunting and fishing and cultural traditions, the knowledge of the elders, but facing many of the same challenges in terms of climate change, uncertainty about the conditions under which you can hunt, that sort of thing. And so at the same time, I think you see a real interest in self-determination, whatever that means. And on the North Slope, I think it meant the creation of the North Slope Borough, Eben Hobson, and the creation of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference in the 1970s, all part of that effort on the North Slope to gain more control over their way of life. And then I think you see that as well in other parts with the emergence of Alaska Native corporations and the Alaska Native land claims, the revitalization of tribes and the importance that tribes play in the state of Alaska today. So I think you do see a lot of parallels. And I would say too, in terms of looking at development and industrial development in particular, the challenge of trying to hold on to what is dear to you in terms of your language, your culture, your way of life, wanting to pass that on to your children, and yet recognizing in a very pragmatic way that the world is changing. And so the question is, how do you shape that change and who calls the shots? I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions.
I'll take two. Thanks, that was a great talk. I appreciate it. First one is really quick. The village you stayed at, was that out of Disco Bay, or where was it located?
It's on the southern tip of Disco Island, or Kapakasawak,
Okay.
Big Island.
The other question concerns about adaptability to climate change. As you, I've worked in Greenland for a few years, and I had the fortune of working on glaciers way up Gotup's Fjord out of Nuuk there. And where we were parked, we actually came across Old Norse settlement. Amazing. You can still see the foundations there. And during my time there, I talked with a woman who's studying anthropology at the University of Copenhagen as a graduate student. She's a wife of a colleague of mine. And she was pursuing this hypothesis. The last time we had strong climate change was during the medieval optimum going into the little ice age. Mm-hmm. And her hypothesis is that the Inuit, as you mentioned, are heavily reliant for subsistence on marine mammals. So as things shifted north, they shifted north with them during the warming period. And that allowed the Norse to move in, and that there was little or no contact between the two groups. And then as the little ice age increased, that ice pack shifted down, and the sea mammal subsistence hunting shifted south, and that caused interaction between the two groups at that time. Do you know about this theory or have any comments about it, and what could have occurred once that this Inuit started interacting with the Norse?
There are accounts on the Greenlandic side of interactions with the Norse population. So there are stories that have been passed down about interactions. And I think you're correct too. There's evidence of Norse traveling in small boats northward to hunt seals. And I think there was an assumption earlier in the literature that the Norse really did not hunt seals, but I think that's not true. The Middens, the evidence from their sites show that they in fact did, and also that they were very interested in walrus ivory and narwhal tusks. Again, those were important trade items. So I think undoubtedly the Norse hunters did interact with the Inuit at various times. There's not a lot of documentation about it except for oral traditions that have been passed on in Greenlandic society.
One quick question. Do you know what's happened with the Faroese settlement? It was, not a settlement really, but a fishery base at Faringhaven. Is that still going on? Do they have any special rights there, or have those all been terminated now?
Yeah, I'm not aware that there are any special rights. I know the history that you're talking about, but I'm not aware of any special rights today. But it's interesting you mentioned the Faroe Islands, which are also part of the Danish realm. And the model for home rule, which was achieved in Greenland in 1979, is something that the Faroese had also achieved, and also the Åland Islands in the Baltic. So the model of home rule is not a new one or unique to Greenland. It was common, or not common, but it was known, I would say, in the Nordic countries. And so what Greenland achieved in 1979, and then ultimately with the Self-Rule Act in 2009, is an outgrowth of that home rule movement of the disparate parts of the Danish realm.
It's good to be colonized by the Danes.
Well, with that, I think we probably ought to wrap this up. I'll say one more time, Gwayanak. I appreciate your interest and your questions. Thanks very much.
That was Richard Caulfield in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded on April 15, 2015 at 360 in Juneau, with support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman & Associates Incorporated, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.